I had zero communications with the electors in Arizona, zero involvement with any of the election challenges in Arizona or legislative hearings.
Former Trump attorney John Eastman in Phoenix this morning, telling the press he was not involved in the alleged plot to overturn the will of the voters in the 2020 election. That statement in direct conflict with sworn testimony given by the former Arizona House Speaker. In 2022, Rusty Bowers told Congress Eastman asked him directly to go along with the plan.
What did Dr. Eastman want you to do?
That we would, in fact, take a vote to overthrow, or I shouldn't say overthrow, that we would decertify the electors.
It's alleged that Eastman led an effort to install a group of so-called fake electors, ones who would give Trump the victory, even though Joe Biden carried Arizona by over 10,000 votes. In some of the most dramatic testimony given to Congress about the alleged scheme, Bowers said he refused Eastman's request.
But in your view, what he was asking you to do would have violated your oath to the Constitution, both the United States Constitution and the Constitution of the state of Arizona.
Yes, sir.
Authorities also released the mugshot of Eastman, as well as 7 others indicted, including the former leader of the Arizona Republican Party, Kelly Ward, and her husband. In total, the grand jury indicted 18 people who face felony charges ranging from fraud and forgery to conspiracy. A conviction could result in possible prison time. And a majority of the people indicted are expected to appear in court next week. The one exception appears to be Rudy Giuliani, who's yet to be served a notice of his indictment. In the newsroom, Dennis Welch, Arizona's Family.
Dennis, thanks. A 3-year